You know, I watched over the last week or so what's going on in Europe. This thing could end up in World War III if we don't get it settled. This could really end up in a World War III.
На высшем уровне. Но как же проводить в этих условиях подобные встречи? О чем говорить? Кто вообще ведет переговоры с теми, кто делает ставку на террор, с террористами? И за что их поощрять, предоставляя передышку в боевых действиях, которая будет использована для накачки режима западным оружием, для продолжения насильственной мобилизации и подготовки других террористических актов, подобных тем, которые были осуществлены в Брянской и Курской областях.
Over the weekend, we saw that Ukraine had conducted Operation Spider's Web, a drone strike operation on Russia, which Russia has classified a terrorist act, reportedly. Zelensky said 117 drones were used in the operation by the SBU security service, striking, quote, 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile carriers, end quote. We should also consider the timing of the attack, a day before another round of peace negotiations was scheduled in Istanbul. If you're really intending to negotiate peace, you don't conduct what the other side deems as terrorism the day before.
And there is a lot coming out across the headlines as we're hearing about nuclear war, World War III attack plans that are being drafted up right now as the United States and NATO are saying that they are preparing for nuclear strike attacks against them coming from Russia and China. We're hearing today Russian President Vladimir Putin coming out and saying we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in case of aggression against Russia. Russia may consider using nuclear weapons once there is a reliable information about a massive launch of missiles and UAVs crossing the border, says Putin.
The bureaucrats, centralists in Brussels are addicted to power. They use or they abuse every crisis. Financial crisis, COVID crisis, Ukraine crisis, energy crisis. And the solution is always the same, and the professor already said it, more European Union. If there's no crisis, and that's the second point, if there's no crisis, they create a crisis.
Hey, Inspired Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers. John Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is Wednesday, June 4th, 2025. Out of the Matrix into Prime Reality. Thank you for joining us on X, Rumble, and YouTube in the live chat at a different hour. We're trying out the evening format, at least for our American viewers, and the morning format for our Australian and New Zealand viewers. Welcome, everyone. You will probably have seen it if you're following what's going on, if you are paying attention to the social media feeds and maybe even some mainstream media outlets. They're beating the war drums again. And, it's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric of the moment and in the fear of the moment. But I tend to take a broader perspective, and that's what we want to offer here today. So there was a massive, according to, the sources, a massive attack a couple days ago by the Ukrainians, or let's say the alliance against some very important infrastructure in Russia. Now, the thing is, in the fog of war, to trust any of that information is it's like a slot machine. Some of that might be true, a lot of that might be propaganda. It might be pushing people into certain things. This is what the problem is, that during war and even after the war is over, so rarely do we actually get any accurate information. So what we can be accurate about is the big picture. The truth is, and let's just look here. We can look at some of these statements here just recently, which I think will give us sort of this is important. Like when the Prime Minister of the UK says, it's hard to call him prime. There's nothing prime about the guy. But when he says we must move toward war fighting readiness, that does mean something. It's not like it's not like that rhetoric is meaningless. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, every leader that has spoken out about the Ukraine-Russia situation has had some very strong language lately. But not just about that. Even the Asian situations that we have, there's a few of those. Of course, Israel, Palestine, or what's left of Palestine. Pete Hegseth said, "Those who long for peace must prepare for war." That's the Secretary of Defense currently. And again, these are all signals. There's noise and there's signals, but these are signals. And the signals are all saying from the representatives of the big players, the signals are everybody's readying for war. And we must probably understand that war means something completely different to them than it does to you and me. Also, in terms of tactics. Then there is, the chief psychopath of the European Union. God, I don't even know how anyone can look at that woman and think there's anything there but psychopathy, but that's just me. And condemning Russia, of course, and basically doing and saying everything she possibly can on the world stage to divide, to fuel the flames of hatred and division. And that's basically what is happening there. And like I said, there was this huge, this is really the reason for the recent flare-up is this Operation Spiderweb. And here are the official facts. Whether they're true or not, again, we cannot say, but supposedly it was a huge strike prepared for 18 months and clearly not conducted by the Ukraine on their own. This, if this strike at this scope has actually happened, it would have included a lot of intelligence. It would have included a lot of moving pieces. Clearly, the help from the Western Alliance and not to speculate, but you can probably imagine who would have to be included here to make such a thing happen. But the truth is that World War III is not about to begin. World War III is not about to start. It actually began a long, long time ago. I would say in 1945, the day after World War II ended, is when World War III began. And I think that these conflicts have been planned for a very, very long time. Why? Because what the power players themselves have been saying publicly is that never let a good crisis go to waste. But that doesn't just mean when a crisis arises, they themselves are experts in creating crises. And so the First World War and the Second World War were, especially in Europe, but of course you look at Japan, look at other places, Vietnam War and many other places. So there were other horrific scenes, but the First and the Second World War, specifically for Europe, they were such mass trauma events. That was freaking brutal, horrific warfare. Tens, hundreds of millions that have died. And the Third World War, I think that the planners, the thinkers, sort of started to think, okay, we're not really weakening the nations, the people, the families by kinetic warfare alone. This is not enough. And the kind of propaganda or psychological warfare that they fought back in the day probably was not strong enough. So starting in, and you can look at this through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, a completely different kind of cultural warfare started. And what they actually did was they perfected the war in education, in health and family, patriotism and nationalism, religion, race, identity, technology. Everything was used to weaken the family system, to weaken the individual, to weaken the moral system that we operate on, to weaken our sense of community and patriotism and togetherness, to create greater division. I mean, it's the year 2025, and even though you look at society today and it's much more colorful, racists living together and sharing spaces, but the underlying tone is still division. And we're just we're being divided by ever smaller boxes. So World War III has really been going on since 1945 at least. And it includes and has included in recent decades technological warfare, cyber warfare. The psychological operations are so sophisticated now. Now you combine that with what we are learning about the biowarfare, hacking into, the field hacking, the biofield hacking, the body hacking. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of psychopaths are we dealing with? Completely unhinged, completely empathy-less psychopaths. They don't have that. And this is what we really need to comprehend, that we are at war. We have been at war. Most of us were born into war, not understanding it. And that kinetic, so actually bombing the shit out of a nation, a city, or anything, that is another tool in their box. It's not a tool that they necessarily hesitate to use. It's not like they have some moral dilemma about using it. And when I talk about they, it's the forces behind the scenes. They have no problem bombing Gaza into the ground. They have no problem bombing Ukraine into the ground, or Russia for that matter, or any other nation. There's really no moral dilemma there. Think about it. Think about what we as a people are tolerating. Let's imagine that a new company would appear on the scene, and that company was, let's say, trying to bring their product to every man, child, and woman in the nation because they think it's the greatest product in the world, and they just want everyone to have it. And then they say, we're going to market this to people. We're going to bring enticements. We're going to bring sales, and we're going to bring discounts. We're going to do all those things. But if none of that works, we're also willing to go to war and force the people. We're also willing to bomb them until they accept that everyone should have this product. Now, that sounds completely insane. Nobody would accept that. But we actually do accept it every single day. We accept this from the governments of the world. We accept this from the militaries and the leaders of the world, that they talk about war and carnage and bombings and complete dehumanization as another tactic. We don't want to, but if we have to, we will. Can you actually comprehend how insane this is? How insane it is that war is a legitimate tactic in our world and time, and that we perhaps are overestimating the collective evolution based on how much war there is still happening and how much we're being threatened with every day. And people say this is just a show, and this is not real, and it's never going to happen. But I'm telling you, it's happening every day. And I can list so many nations and peoples. I'll tell you what, I have intimate connections to the Balkan countries, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia. Ask them whether war is real or just a show. Ask them, and that's 30 years ago, but still horrific warfare. And how many other places? Ukraine, Russia in the last few years. For them, that is very real. And we are at this place where we have to ask ourselves, what is it exactly that we can contribute to another direction? And at the very least, very least, and I know this isn't the best scenario, but the very least, we have to freaking get outraged. And if nothing else, and there's much more we can do, but we have to completely and unequivocally show that that's simply not something that will be supported. And whether that requires protest, which I think is never the most efficient way, but it is something for sure. But also think about what would happen if every mother, specifically mother, would call their sons and daughters who are in the military and say, listen, how about not going to war? How about not participating in this? And this is where we get to the point where there was this saying, and it's been around for 56 years now. Imagine if they started a war and nobody showed up. What would happen? Because the truth is, they started other things over the last decades and nobody showed up. People recently asked me whether I think that we're going to see a new 2020 event, like, in that big way. And I said, I don't currently see it. It doesn't mean it can't happen. But I'll tell you this, before they were able to pull off 2020, the big bullshit show, they were trying for years and years and years, and it didn't work. People didn't participate. They just couldn't pull it off, and they tried. So there is a lot of times their plans fail, but it requires our awareness. And there's something that people say that shows me just how ignorant they often are. You know what they say? Oh no, they'd never do that. They'd never start a big war. They'd never start a war here in America. They'd never do that. Oh shit, you wouldn't. They would. They are. They don't care if it serves them and if that's what's necessary. And we also need to remember that despite recent psychological operations, their agenda is still active. They are still planning to bring about an anti-human technocratic dystopia. They're still working on that every single day, while people are debating whether that is possible or real, or they're actually embracing AI as a new form of consciousness that we should include in our prayers and thoughts and love, just like our fellow human beings. Pardon my sarcasm, but let's get real. If you don't think that this is really happening, and if there's nothing that you want to contribute to the transformation of this, get the fuck out of the way. Just step up to the sideline and do your thing. There's nobody keeping you from doing that. But there is way more at stake here than what meets the eye. And what we actually can do, which is so important, is sovereignize and free ourselves from the chains of the belief systems that we were taught. For example, that war is a legitimate tool. I'm not saying don't defend yourself when you are attacked. I'm the first person to say, if you get attacked, if somebody attacks your family, breaks into your home, do whatever you have to do to neutralize that threat. Here it's pretty natural that if in America, for example, or most parts of America, if somebody breaks into your house and you're there and your kids are there, you shoot them. There's a bunch of sheriffs all over America that will tell you in press conferences, that's what we recommend you do. And I have no problem with that. If somebody does that, wants to threaten your family or, is a danger, you got to do what you got to do. But that is one thing to defend yourself. And there's one thing to defend yourself against aggression. But what this is really about is using war, using carnage, using the worst kind of human suffering. And we can observe that right now in places in the world. Unbelievable things. Use it to bring about a new system, to bring about a new kind of dystopian control society. And there is no government in the world that can stop this. The people, they can. Governments can't. They are under control. And those who are not under control, they pay the price pretty quickly. And so the solutions they don't lie in politics. They don't lie in governments. I'm sorry to say that there might be some every now and then there's someone there who might do some good things, but the solutions lie with the people. And when there's no one there who's willing to go and fight another banker's war and fight another psychopath's war, well, then war won't happen. And what is also important is that we ourselves become balanced, harmonious, peaceful. This sounds so ironic when when they're beating the war drum, and then you say, well, I think we might have to meditate a little more. Might have to create more peace, but it is part of the solution. Think about the experiments that have been done. We talked about this. Remember the miracle of Washington, D.C. of 1993, where transcendental meditators came together, and all they did, they meditated. And crime went down significantly. It was done in, I believe, in Lebanon. The war activity went down significantly. In some way, in some places, it even stopped completely. We do have a great level of influence, but we feel powerless because we can't stop world leaders, so-called world leaders, from making incredibly reckless statements. We certainly can't stop the control of troop movements and the launch of rockets. But what we can do is shift the consciousness. We have control over that. And as a matter of fact, I would say that's what they're most afraid of, that we actually regain that control and that we work on that day and night. And I'm absolutely not against action. But here's the difference. You could have 1,000 people protesting. Let's just say a protest, okay? You could have them protest, and they would violently protest against something. They would be outraged and angry and loud, and it would seem extremely effective, right? 1,000 loud people stomping and screaming and whatnot. And then you have 2 streets over, 1,000 people that are focusing, let's say in this specific situation, focusing on peace. They're focusing on love. They're really raising the vibration. Believe it or not, in the eyes of the media and the observers, they're going to focus on the loud ones. But the ones who are having way more effect are actually the quiet, peaceful, loving people. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it is the truth. And that is something that we can do. So whether you're sitting in a cabin somewhere in Wisconsin, or whether you're somewhere in Australia, or you're in a big city, or you're part of a group, or you're an activist, who you are when you show up for peace, who you are when you show up for unity, who you are when you show up for these things matters more than what you say, matters more than all the other stuff. It's the energy that we bring to the table. And I simply don't see that kind of energy, that positive kind of energy, in anyone who's in a decision-making position right now. These people are largely controlled, and they're controlled by the same forces that steered the First World War, the Second World War, and have been steering this World War. And only when we withdraw our consent, when we actually pull back our energy from this, they don't have a lot to work with. And so, you know, it's much, much easier to do this while bombs are not flying. And that's why I said they will try to use this if it serves them, right? They will try to use it if it serves them. And think about the strategic attacks of recent years. Think about Paradise, California. Think about Maui. Think about Hurricane. Was it Helene? There were so many. Think about these strategic attacks where it served them to clean out and empty out an entire area so they could build what? Their new thing, or mine, or do something that they needed to do. And they have strategic surgical strikes. So if you think we're not at war in the United States, what did happen in Maui? Was there a brush fire that got out of control because it was very windy? And did none of the water supplies work, or were they turned off maybe? Did they stand down on purpose? Did they keep people locked into the zones where the fires were going? What is that but an attack? Has that ever been publicly said? And has that ever been actually acknowledged, and something done about that? No. So we are, and if we don't acknowledge that, once again, that which we are not aware of, the problem that we don't identify correctly, we can't do anything about. So, as esoteric and woo-woo as it sounds, our first and foremost actions need to go into the raising of consciousness, as loving and as peaceful as we can. A loving, unified, peaceful nation most likely won't have to deal with war. And if they do, they will be the strongest force to be reckoned with, and that war won't last very long. A divided, a fighting, a low vibing, a depressed, a sick nation, that's easy to make war with. And that's what we need to work on. That's what we're doing every day. And the last piece of this puzzle is that, believe it or not, I know for a fact that some of the people who actually have decision-making power, who are in powerful positions, they're watching right now, and not just here, but in other places, and they're hearing these words too. Their hearts are remembering some of these truths too. Their spirits are being ignited too. And we should never underestimate the power of love, the power of spirit when it comes in, and accept that it is possible for people to change their hearts and change their minds, which is the true meaning of repentance. So if we get so cynical that we believe that we can't reach any of those people and that their hearts are too closed off or too cold, wherever there's a real human being with a real spirit, they can be reached. It might not happen, but it is possible. And we should never underestimate that power. So I want to send specifically love and courage, and also a certain level of understanding for the difficulty of their position, to go into those fields, to be a good-hearted, spirited human being and go into the fields of politics and government and believe that you can make some kind of difference. That requires an incredible level of energy and backbone and courage. And I just want to say I respect that. It might not be the path that I would take, but I respect that people are taking that path. And I know that good people are sitting in positions where they can make a difference. They can be a pain in the ass of someone who's trying to do something bad. They can put even a stop to certain things. And I just want to send out and say, I believe in you. And if it's in your heart to do that, I know you can actually make that happen. And we should try to, or do our best to include those folks too, and not draw those hard lines. Because when it comes to warfare, ask anyone who's ever been to war. I haven't been to war as a soldier, and whenever there was danger back in the day of that Balkan War, we were removed from those places. But I've seen it. I've seen what it does to soldiers. I've seen what it does to families. I've seen what it does to communities and nations. I've seen the horrors and the carnage. There's nothing glorious about it. There's nothing empowering about it. There's nothing good about it. They're gonna keep beating the war drums. Why? Because they saw that in the beginning days of the Ukraine war, they were able to mobilize tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of young people who, let's just say, politically probably align more with what you would consider the left. And think about the classic liberals, peace-loving folks. They were the ones on the streets screaming and chanting that everybody should send all their money and all their weapons to Ukraine so they can fight the war harder. They saw that that's possible. They saw that it's possible to mobilize young people, students, to chant and scream for war. And they screamed for winning rather than for peace, for talks, for negotiations. So they know the more that they beat the war drums, the likelier it is that they're going to catch some fish and get people on their side who are going to say, yeah, that's the only way to go. We got to fight. We got to go. We got to win. And here I want to quote our dear friend Greg Braden, who said, we will not win, because winning happens when you are kind of fighting at the same level. And he said, we won't win. We will triumph. We will triumph. That's what Greg said. Triumph means you are way up here. There's not even competition. We will triumph. And we have to carry that in our spirit and in our heart every single day. It is easy to start hating those folks. It is easy to start pointing fingers and talking just about the evil and the psychopaths and focusing on that. And there's a certain level of awareness that needs. But we can't let our heart start hating. That's what they want. They don't care who we hate, as long as we hate. They don't care whom we fight, as long as we fight. They don't care how we divide ourselves and how we separate ourselves from each other, as long as we do it. So we have to come together more. Like I've said before, there's a reason why, for example, the Russian social media and, sort of influencer and podcaster scene is virtually unknown to us here. Why do you think that's cut off from us? Why do you think these divisions are happening? Do you think that if we had more access to the Russian people, the everyday folks, and how they think and what their thoughts and fears and dreams are, that we might possibly realize that we're much more alike than we're different? That's always what happens. We're getting cut off. So we don't know what these folks are thinking and what their life goals are. And then it's easy to sell a story about the barbarians, about the bad people, about how it's in their history and their blood, how they can't help themselves. Those bullshit stories, they're not true. It's propaganda, and it's being done at a higher level than ever before because of technology. So I just want to close this by saying that love will not win, my friends. Love will triumph every single time. All right. I'm sending you much love, many blessings, my friends. And we will be back with you again very, very soon.
Your environment shapes everything, your thoughts, your health, your energy. But most people never question the invisible field they live in. We did, and that's when FLFE found us. It's not a product, it's a field of pure life force energy that lifts everything it touches. We now live in it 24/7, and we would love to invite you to experience it too. Start your free 15-day trial now. No pressure, no strings attached. Just the truth, resonance, and peace.